Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Center video podcast. Today our guest in Finland, Turku is Glen Grant. He is a lieutenant colonel, retired from the British Army. He is a senior fellow of the Baltic Security Foundation and a businessman. Thank you for having time for this.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Look, we are currently here in Turku, Finland, and we have the biggest NATO air defense exercises since years, and it seems to be about the air defense of our space. And we have a lot of threats which we have seen since the last 15 months. In Ukraine, these are cruise missile attacks on the critical infrastructure, suicidal drone attacks, and other air threats. Are we capable in NATO to protect our countries from these threats?
That's a really good question, and it's one of these what-if questions, because of course NATO is a big beast, and it runs all the way from the west side of Turkey, along right up the side of the Black Sea, round Ukraine, round Belarus, round the Baltic states to Finland, across Finland, and then across Norway. Now, don't ask me how long that is, but I can tell you it's a really, really, really long way. So should Russia, let's say Russia, Greater Russia and Belarus together, should they decide that they're going to attack somewhere along that continuum, then they will have no difficulty attacking NATO and no difficulty scoring whatever they want to score. Because it's simply too long, and when they do it, if we're not ready for it in that particular sector, then it's going to hit us and hit us hard. And this is one of the reasons why NATO is so adamant that countries have got to get their 2%, up to their 2% and better. At the moment, 3%, with a large chunk of that being spent on air defense. Now let's jump back a bit into Russia, because Russia basically could shoot anywhere it wants to if it decides it's going to take on NATO. Now I don't know if you've read, but they're also now making their own drones based upon the Iranian model. So they could actually in a year's time have a an extra amount of drones that they could actually throw somewhere. But of course, at the moment, they don't want to throw it against NATO, because really the number one power that we have is NATO air. And that NATO air, when you bring in the American air and put it next to Finns and Swedes and Norwegians and Brits, then that is overwhelming against Russia. Russia would not be able to deal with that sort of air threat. They just haven't got enough ability to deal with that. But missiles is a different thing. You can throw missiles and forget them, which is exactly what they're doing in Ukraine at the moment.
So do I understand you correctly that the best protection of NATO regarding a possible confrontation with Russia when Russia uses drones or missiles is not our air defense capacities, but our retaliation capacities?
Yes. At the moment, I mean, we've got a lot of air defense capacities. Don't underestimate what is there, what Germany has got, what America has got. But if you then jump and say, okay, what's Bulgaria got? And the answer is 0. What's Romania got? Very little. What air defense strength have the Baltic states got? Almost 0. So there are huge areas, there are huge gaps in the system, and Russia knows this because when you're doing air defense exercises with ground-based air defense, you turn the radars on. So it's very easy to pick those up from satellite, to pick them up from other means, to see who's got what. So you're right, it's the retaliatory power, and it is power. I mean, B-1 bombers and all the aircraft, it is huge power. And that is what Russia doesn't want to play against. But it could still make an awful mess of somewhere if it wanted to. And you can see that in Ukraine because although Kiev is extremely well protected, and especially now with Patriot, there are other cities like Odessa and Kiev Rig and Dnieper that are really very weakly held. And Zaporizhzhia is getting hammered. They're very weakly held because there's just not enough air defense to go round everywhere.
So if I understand you correctly, and please forgive me if I'm wrong in what I even say now, that this amazing capacity of the Ukrainian air defense when they shut down like 6 Kinjal air-launched hypersonic missiles within one day, or when they hit like 80% or 85% of caliber missiles which are targeted against Kiev. This is because the Ukrainians have amazing concentration of air defense, which we don't have logically over
Absolutely,
our airspace.
we don't have that over Berlin, for example, and you would need a similar strength of air defence over Berlin or over Riga or over Tallinn to ensure that you knock down those aircraft. So the reality is not the reality of the knocking down the aircraft and how brilliant the air defence is doing, and it is doing brilliantly, no question, in Ukraine, is that you need to look at the smaller cities that are being hit. That is more the reality. But then, one could almost say that the good thing is, despite the fact that there's all this attacks, that the numbers being killed are low. I mean, they don't compare at all with, for example, the Blitz in London in the Second World War, where the numbers were monstrous in, tens of thousands. So 4 or 5 or 6 people, we are extremely lucky. Maybe that's better buildings, maybe it's, lower quality missiles or whatever, but we've been very lucky so far, or Ukrainians have been very lucky, because my goodness, it could have been a lot worse, and this is partly Russia incompetence, and partly the quality of what air defence there is there. They are actually knocking down a higher than average score, which is in itself remarkable, because I don't think before the war anybody even in NATO in their right mind would have said that the quality of air defence, ground air defence, would be as good as it was. And certainly I see that there were comments from the managing director of the Patriot missiles that he didn't understand that Patriot was so good. So that's where we are. That's where we are, which is why deterrence is pretty much the key thing for NATO. But I don't think that Russia wants to play against NATO at the moment.
The Russian incompetence, which saves practically Ukrainian lives against the will of the Russians. That will be our next question. But before I ask it, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to our channel, and write your comments into the commentary section. So you have said that the amount of civilian deaths, although it is of course horrible, it's horrible, but it is comparably low to other mass bombing rates which we know from the history, and that can be the Russian incompetence. That is what Ukrainians said all the time. We're lucky, they said, that the Russians are so stupid. That is the quote. Yeah. What did this war demonstrated us with the quality of the Russian military doctrine and the Russian combat troop competence?
Okay, well, you need to go back in time to understand this. You've got to go back to 20, 30 years ago, where basically after the war fell, the Russians have not done anything to make themselves militarily sane and sound, because they've got no values in the system. The value is thieving, corruption. It's a power-based system, which means that to exist, it exists on lies completely from bottom to top. No officer is going to say that he's a failure. Selection is by friends, not by performance. In fact, performance is dangerous, because and you have to understand the culture of this, is that if you start to perform well, by your very performance, you are suggesting that the man above you should not be there. They don't have this thing that we do in the West, where the man above is so proud that the young officers that he's got are really good. You will find every commanding officer in Britain and America boasting, I've got the best young officers, my majors are brilliant, I'm so proud that they've done this and they've done that. It's the other way around in the Russian system. It's that you don't want anybody to show that you are not as good as they are. And of course that carries on into all hosts of things in the way that people work. And the big driver is, of course, stealing. The big driver was stealing all the way up to Putin, Gerasimov, Shoigu. It's how much money can we make from what we're doing.
That is what we saw, like when the Americans analyzed the number like of the Russian capable troops, they analyzed the paper number of the fuel they had.
Absolutely. And you know, so on that first attack around Kiev, there were vehicles with no soldiers in. Why? Well, because the commanding officer had said, I've got 465 soldiers, when in fact he's only got 210. But he's put in that extra money, he's getting the extra money and putting it in his pocket. So these vehicles are going there with nobody in the back. And of course, you know, when you have a whole system like that with no values of any sort, nobody trains properly, because you haven't got enough soldiers, and B, you don't care, because there is absolutely no value in being good.
So Russian corruption is our friend.
Yeah, in a way. I mean, you can see that some of this, of course, has been historically part of the Ukrainian system, because they came from the same, but you know, not the same gene pool, but the same educative process previously. And now Ukrainian is weeding it out and is gradually cutting down on it, and society is trying to drive this, squeeze any of this corruption out of the system. But in Russia, they haven't done that at all. I mean, you can still see, you know, where are you getting your soldiers from? Let's go to a prison and take murderers and people like this, which actually makes their whole incompetence in some areas worse. It doesn't make the soldiering on the front line worse, because some of those people are of a soldiering type mentality. They're not frightened to kill. They're not frightened of risking life. They're not frightened of doing dangerous things, because that's what got them in prison in the first place.
Well, they took decisions fast. They analyzed it.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. But it's been their lifestyle. They just messed it up and ended up in prison. So you've got this, and then on the other side, you've got all these people that have been conscripted because they're weak and couldn't run away. Most of whom don't want to fight, don't want to be there. They've been given no training. They've been given old weapons. They're not fed. And when I say not fed, I mean not fed. I mean, they have to go and forage for food. And of course, they're all of this mentality of you know, steal everything you can. So everywhere they go, their main aim is theft, is stealing the toilets, the fridges and the washing machines from the houses that they can find. And that's exactly what they're doing.
That is exactly what I wanted to ask you further, like the morale of the Russian army. We know that in the history, like many armies, and our German army did terrible things on industrial level. But still, when we live now in the 21st century, and when you're not your foot soldiers, like who you have conscripted from some village or from a prison, but you're high-skilled officers, highly educated.
Yeah, but they don't have any. But they don't have any high-skilled officers.
But someone has to.
They go on courses. They go on courses. It's all a lie. It's all a lie, because they're teaching religion, Soviet religion, and those days have gone. So they don't have highly skilled officers, because the same reason. If you're highly skilled, you're a threat. So you don't have to be highly skilled. You just have to exist. And therefore, you know, when you're in charge of people, what are you doing when you're in charge? Thieving, making money, bullying. I mean, and they're bullying. I mean, when you know from the conscripts that you know, bullying was rife. Death amongst conscripts in Russia has been rife. I mean, because there's no management system. I mean, don't forget, there are no senior ranks, proper senior ranks. You don't have sergeants and sergeant majors. Sergeants are effectively conscripts in their second or third year. So they're not sergeants. They're lance corporals. They're the first rank soldier. The officers are doing all the work of the sergeants, and they do that from the beginning. So imagine that you are doing a sergeant's work when you're a second lieutenant or a lieutenant, a young officer. What do you learn doing that? Do you learn to be an officer? No, you don't. So by the time you get to be a colonel, all you are is the equivalent of a sergeant major in the German army or the British army. You're not a colonel, because you've never been allowed to do any thinking. You only follow orders. You've been selected for colonel because you follow orders quickly. In other words, when someone says do this, you do it quickly. He's a good boy. He does it quickly.
And you drink hard.
And you drink hard, and you thieve, and you bring in money from your soldiers for your boss.
Does this explain why the Russian officers, up to very high level, why they give that inhuman orders, like to send wave after wave of Shahed drones to civilians, to mass rape villages, etc.?
I think it partially goes to that. I mean, you have an army that's had no human values, and there are a lot of officers who believe that this is the right way to do things. So you persecute a war using human beings to win, and no value is placed on the human beings. You could see this from the other side in Russia. There is zero value placed upon anybody. There are wave attacks. Go and die, you know. And if and you don't have a rifle, pick up his rifle if he dies. I mean, this is literally what is happening in places. But, and there is a big but, it has been changing over the winter, because the West did not deliver weapons quickly enough to Ukraine to allow Ukraine to do anything. And so during this time, Russia has been sorting itself out. And also you've got coming into the system now people, businessmen, and people with more competence, because the army, the regular army, was totally incompetent. They could just die. I mean, we saw this around Kiev, basically, that they just didn't really know what they were doing. But now you've got civilians coming into the system who are maybe in charge of 10 or 15, 20 people, and they've got a brain. And some of them have now had time to think about what they're doing. So every time, having given Russia the initiative for 7 months, 8 months, basically they have improved in areas and got better. That doesn't make the management any better, but it does make some of the soldiers better. And they've also been doing lessons learnt. Actually, in some ways, lessons learnt faster and better than the Ukrainians. And so you saw around Bakhmut different ways of fighting, you know, actually adapting their fighting, because if they don't, they die. And so you've got people who don't want to die, so they adapt their fighting to make sure they don't die. So giving them the initiative has allowed them to semi-professionalize the incompetence. But it is still, at its heart, it's still Soviet, no values and incompetent, even though packets of units, because they're getting lots more drones now from Russia to use, so they're actually better off for drones, better off for electronic warfare, because Russia is fixing those things, but you're still putting things that are good on top of people that are not so good.
Did we give Russia a break? Did we provide Russia with some time to regroup, to find some new ways to fight this war? That will be the next part of our interview. But before we go to this part, don't forget to share, to like, to subscribe, and to comment in the commentary section. What you taught about the adapting of the warfare to this war is extremely interesting. You said that Russians use drones now much more active.
They're getting more.
They're getting more.
They're getting more. I mean, don't forget that Russia, I mean, we all talk about the volunteers supporting the Ukrainians, but there are volunteers supporting the Russians as well, on the Russian side. And of course, it's a much bigger country, a lot more money, and a lot more volunteers, I suspect. There are complexities in all this, because the Russian Ministry of Defense has a bottomless pool of money, apparently, and so is able to buy drones, is getting them from, I think, from China, probably making their own in factories now. So they've been gearing up the defense industry, whereas the defense industry in Ukraine is pretty much moribund. And there are a whole host of reasons for that, primarily political. But we did give the Russians time. We gave them this chunk of 7 months, and the West must take some guilt for that, I'm afraid. You know, I mean, how long has it taken Scholz to understand we're at war? A year.
That is exactly what Ukrainians told us all the time. Like
Yeah,
last
well,
summer.
and so did the Baltic states before. All 3 Baltic states. So did Poland before. And countries were ignoring what they were saying, and they were very clear. So did the Finns before. I mean, the Finns, that's why they headed to NATO. They realized that this was effectively a European war before the major part of the war started on 24th. I mean, I wrote numerous pieces saying clearly that this was going to happen. I was on television in Ukraine saying this was going to happen in the year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years leading up to this attack. I mean, my first major article, which said this was going to happen, came out in January 2018. So there's no, you know, and that was read nationally by government and by politicians. So I know that people knew.
That is absolutely correct. But are we now like independently on the time we lost already in the past? Are we now better prepared? Are we now supporting Ukraine enough?
No, we're still not supporting it enough because we still haven't grasped that this is in the eyes of Russia a long-term war. So they're gearing up industry faster than the West is, and we're getting a bit smug about ourselves, in that we're doing this and we're doing that. And it's all very nice, but it's slow. It's bureaucratic. I mean, and we still haven't managed to. We still haven't managed to bully people like Switzerland, Austria, India. We haven't persuaded them of what's going on. You know, the anti-America rhetoric hasn't dropped. The anti-America, this long-term hate about the positiveness of America is destroying a lot of things that our countries shouldn't be doing. They should be supporting Ukraine. I mean, why is India not supporting Ukraine properly? It's a good question. Why do they think it's more important to play politics than to actually to stick with values? I don't have an answer to that. I can tell you now, because I go on TV quite often with India. In fact, this morning I was on Indian TV. The journalists are actually really positive about Ukraine and supporting Ukraine. But they still get caught up with the pro-Russia rhetoric. They still catch as though Putin is saying something that's significant, when in fact he's just lying.
He lies all the time.
He lies all the time. He lies all the time. And I cannot see why so many politicians in the West have not grasped that this is an essential war against Europe and the world by Russia and China.
But when we look at the deliveries, I totally agree that we have not delivered enough neither tanks nor IFVs, and we have delivered, which we have, too late. But there are some types of weapons we have not delivered at all, like the jets.
Correct.
Is there any chance that Ukraine gets jets?
I think they will. I mean, I think it's been agreed that they will. I think that there will be, I am fairly sure, confident that there are pilots under training today somewhere. I don't know where, because that's not public. My instinct tells me that it's going on, and may have actually been going on for 6 months already. But yeah, they will get jets sooner or later. But in the meantime, there's an awful lot of dead Ukrainians, because they're currently starting a counterattack with an air defense deficit against aircraft.
Because they had to protect their cities.
Because because the cities is strategic air defense. What we're talking about is tactical air defense. Those things, aircraft, so fighter aircraft, attack helicopters, and ground-based air defense that follows closely behind the brigades.
Like the Gepard.
Like the Gepard. I mean, but you need a Gepard for every battalion, basically. And you look at the length of ride. You take the Gepards, great, we've got Gepards for the brigades. Start spreading them out and putting them down, and then see how much of the ground they cover. Donetsk and 100 kilometers. Donetsk and 150 kilometers, and we've got 2,800 kilometers to cover. So they're wonderful. I love Gepard, but it's not enough. We need all the Gepards in Europe.
If we look at the current Ukrainian offensive, like we cannot say anything about the major goal because I think Ukrainians still are checking where they will like push with their mass forces. But if we imagine that the Ukrainians will like liberate the southern Ukraine, the south of Ukraine, and will come closer to Crimea, and even if Ukrainians will liberate Crimea and take control of all of their sovereign territory, the danger of Russian missile attacks will not disappear.
No, it won't go away. Now, this is you've got two things have got to happen, and maybe not, maybe one, you know, separately or maybe together. The first one is there's got to be an understanding in Russia that they've lost. That's number one. And if they don't understand they've lost, they'll just keep firing missiles, and maybe that's the way it will continue for a while. The second thing that's got to happen is the US has got to take the war seriously, and has got to tell Russia stop. You know, and that means maybe after Crimea is taken and they go back to the border, then someone, the US president has actually got to say, this war is now ended, you must stop. Otherwise we're joining in. Otherwise, you know, this will be us in future. You're fighting us. And until any Western country says that, I don't think Russia will take Ukraine seriously. I think it needs Poland. You know, the whole thing has got to build up to a point where Joe average Russian starts saying, well, you know, do we really want a war against everybody that we're going to lose?
And this brings me back to the first question, like how good can we protect our countries against a possible Russian attack? If we have now in the Baltic Sea, we have practically all the countries are the NATO countries, except of Sweden. We have most probably after this war is get won by Ukraine, we have once again a total control of the good countries over the Black Sea. How does it impact the Russian influence with the diminishing of their influence on two of the seas which were so important for them?
Well, I think if at the end of the war, I don't think influence matters. I think trade will matter. And so, I mean, if there's no fighting, then and Russia is not playing its usual game of trying to bully everybody, if that stops, then trade will just restart, and I think quite quickly. So they won't need influence, because the influence then will be wheat, you know, and whatever it is that they've got to sell, oil and gas again. So, you know, this comes back to this thing about, you know, do you respect Russia? Well, the answer is you can't buy respect. In the same way, you can't really buy influence. You know, you get influence by being good at what you do and by people accepting it. And this is something that Russia and Russians just simply don't understand. They think you can bully your way to influence and bully your way to respect, when in fact you can see from this war that it's had the reverse effect, that the bullying has actually brought together a consortium of 50 countries going to support Ukraine, you know, and having big meetings together, something that's never happened in world history, of a consortium of so many people.
Maybe the Crimea War of middle 19th century.
I'm not sure that there were 50 countries getting together to support.
No, but if we look at this war, is it a wake-up call for the NATO countries like Germany to finally invest 2% of the GDP?
I think you need to look at it wider and say that is it a wake-up call for the West? And the answer to that is yes. It's a wake-up call because we've had all this nice peace. I mean, you know, Europe has just gone to sleep and gone flabby and lazy. And I can remember sitting in someone's room in Germany during the Cold War time, drinking whiskey, and one of the officers, actually, I shouldn't mention him, Bill Hargreaves, who was really, really clever, and Bill Hargreaves said, sooner or later we're going to come up and have to fight someone who actually wants to win and who's intelligent, and You know, I mean, you could say that this is what we've come up against. We're not ready. We've begun to think that everybody's nice and you can do everything by diplomacy. Well, you can do whatever you want by diplomacy until someone decides that they don't want to play diplomacy, which is exactly what Putin has been doing. He's been warning us for years. So is it a wake-up call? Tell me how many people are woken up still. Has Austria woken up? No. Switzerland? No. Brazil? No. India? No. So there's all these countries that, you know, I'm going to say supposed democracies, do not realize that this is about the destruction of democracy. The destruction of democracy so that individual leaders and the kleptocracy actually can gain power and gain all the resources. Because it's the kleptocracy we're fighting in Russia. We're not fighting Russia, don't forget that. We're fighting a mafia kleptocracy. And people don't grasp that, or maybe you could say some of the Austrians do, because they want to be part of it, rather than actually having to be part of, you know, supporting Ukrainian society. So that wake-up call is there, but there are an awful lot of people still who have not woken up and who haven't realized how serious this is. I would say 95% of Europe wants to manage this war on their peacetime terms. But Russia isn't playing that game. And we've been lucky so far that they haven't done something else.
So we need Ukraine for continuing this
We
fight.
need Ukraine to continue, but we also need to wake up because we've got huge vulnerabilities in our pipelines, in our internet. I mean, you know, if someone decides to slam the internet between America and Britain and America and Europe, we're all in trouble because we rely on that for our security. We rely on the gas pipelines and the oil pipelines under the North Sea in places.
And that was exactly the German idea that as long as we trade gas with Russia, Russia has interest in our money, and that's why there will be no war.
We've seen from you know, the blowing up their own pipeline that they don't care. They don't care because none of these things matter to them. All that matters is winning and control.
That's true, but let me jump to another question. When we are talking about waking up calls and about our understanding of how we can fight and with what weapons we can fight for our democracy, what are, from your perspective, the chances of Ukraine to have a solid military production? And other countries like Poland, we know that there is a lot of discussion in Poland to rearm its army. Where will all the weapons come from in the world?
That's a good question. I don't have an answer for that. I really don't have an answer for that because I look at it and I see that, you know, there are some countries that are, some firms that are beginning to gear up. Let us say, you know, thank God for Rheinmetall, who are taking this war seriously, but there are an awful lot of other countries aren't yet. You know, there's still a lot of smugness in what we're doing without thinking about how do we move forward? Well, the governments have got to move this forward because, you know, we're now back into the nation state game. But so there's an awful lot of countries still, Denmark, you know, doing nothing, basically. You know, they're handing over some stuff. Yeah, thank you. But are they actually taking, you know, the need for really pushing 3% of money in and starting to really gear up for a war? No, because most of Europe, most of the West does not believe this war is going to get any wider. They're not, which in my mind tells me they're not looking at it hard enough.
But that is the classic tragedy of commons. If you're protected by a huge community, then you may save a bit money and say, okay, I'm still protected by everyone.
Well, you're being protected by the big community, and then you're being protected by by Ukrainians dying for you. So, you know, you could say there's 2 steps away from Denmark or 2 steps away from someone else. I mean, I have to say, you know, great praise for my own country, for Great Britain, who I think really are actually taking this war more seriously than most. But they still need to do more for the army and navy and air force than they're doing at than they are at the moment, because we may have to go and fight. This may get to the stage where we actually have to commit and put troops on the ground. We haven't had anything nasty now, but what are we going to do if they do blow up the power station and we end up with a, you know, not a nuclear holocaust, as like but half of Ukraine could, well, I mean, you just end up with another Chernobyl area where, you know, just a huge area of country is you say unlivable. And it depends, you know, as it's right next to Zaporizhzhia with, I don't know, what's Zaporizhzhia, 5 million people around there in the greater area? Even if it's less, let's say it's 2, it's still a lot of people who would have to be rehoused, who would have to be, you know, would have to move and go where, you know, I mean, and of course, which way does the wind blow? So these things are, you know, are we going to take that seriously if he does that? I mean, we've just basically ignored a dam blowing up, you know, with this huge amount of destruction. And the West has basically, apart from volunteers from countries, hundreds of minibuses. In fact, there's so much stuff gone south that they say they've actually got more food per person than they can possibly give them.
That is like what still makes me really furious, because the water reservoir of Zaporizhzhia, of Nova Kakhovka, is 5 times bigger by its square than the Lake Constance.
Yeah. And
just imagine, like 5 Lake Constance have been flushed over Germany and France. That would be the catastrophe of the world scale.
Yes, and I mean, much smaller catastrophes get much more coverage on TV and support from the, you know, immediate support from the West. I did not see hundreds of boats crossing the Ukrainian border to go and help people in Kherson. You know, so is that war weariness? Is that just a lack of understanding of really, you know, the nature of the beast that we're fighting? I don't know, but frankly, when things like that don't happen, that should happen, I am slightly disgusted with politicians that don't understand that, you know, we should have had serious support in there, and the United Nations did nothing. Where, you know, they just said Russia won't let us in. Well, fine. Then where's the UN resolution calling for troops on the ground or something? Everybody's frightened of this. Everybody's frightened of Russia, and yet actually Russia is doing its worst already.
And we just like invite Russia to make the next steps because we haven't reacted to the previous ones. Correct. But this is really very disturbing. But unfortunately, the time of our interviews really goes faster than I wished it will. That's why my last question is, can we hope with the current level of support for Ukraine and current level of the Russian army that this war will end with Ukrainian victory this year?
No, I don't think so. I don't think this year. I think it's going to drag on a bit longer. But every time I say that, I will also say that the Russian forces could literally collapse overnight. And if they get through them and they get behind them and do this sort of action, which is what the Poles did to them, I think, in 1920, then the Russians will collapse and they'll go backwards. So I think that we need to understand it could go either way. If they don't manage to get through and it remains this war of, as someone said, the small Soviet army fighting the large Soviet army, I've written that loads of times, but I can't claim it for myself. It was an Israeli friend who said it. But this is what they're doing at the moment. So it's step by step by step by step. Because there hasn't been time to teach people maneuver warfare. Maneuver warfare is really difficult, and they can't do it. And you need, you know, you saw with the maneuver warfare in the Second World War, the Blitzkrieg was a fine combination of armor, infantry, and air.
But haven't the Ukrainians demonstrated this sort of fighting in the Kharkiv offensive last summer?
No. Kharkiv was just pushing forward. It wasn't breakthrough. Sorry, Kharkiv. I'm wrong. Kherson was just pushing forward. Kharkiv, yes, but the truth of the matter is that they never expected that. They were just attacking Izium, and of course when they got behind Izium, as you know, the whole of the brigade in Izium just literally got up, stole bicycles, women's clothes, and ran away. and left the tanks and everything there completely, you know, still with ammunition and everything in them. So we know that they'll do this. And then, of course, then there was an advance, and there was an advance because the Russians hadn't, at that stage, hadn't put lots of trench lines together or anything, you know, they hadn't done any defense, they weren't expecting it. So they went backwards quite quickly. And then the Ukrainians basically ran out of steam, which is quite understandable, actually, at that stage, and for a first go. But you know, it's entirely possible, as I say, if they break through, that the Russians will run, and if they run, they'll run, and Crimea will disappear, because no one wants to get caught on Crimea, because they know they won't be able to get across the bridge, because there'll just be so many people. So they'll start to go early.
This will be like running from Crimea by the White Army of Wrangel in 1921.
They'll run.
Let us hope that this will happen very soon, that the Russian army will collapse and Ukraine will be free and victorious. But as we have discussed already, even this will not mean that Ukraine will remain out of danger, and we will still have to protect our freedom and our safety. Thank you so much for this talk, and don't forget to subscribe, to like, and to share this video, and stay with us with our next amazing interview guests.